You finish reading the argument and you think you understand it, so you move on to the choices and boom, every single one looks kind of right, or sort of related, or like something a philosophy professor might nod at. But when you try to match them back to the argument, none of them click. So you reread the stimulus. You reread the answers. Now the clock is ticking, your confidence is tanking, and you're thinking, I should know this, but I don't know what they're even asking. Sound familiar? This is exactly why principal questions feel so intimidating. Not because they're harder, but because they're structured differently from most other LSAT questions, and no one teaches you how to actually think through them. Here's what makes them so tricky. First, they use abstract language on purpose. Instead of asking something clear like, what's the flaw, or what strengthens this, they use words like generalization, principle, conforms, underlies, and justifies. If you don't know what those words mean in LSAT logic terms, you're going to freeze, because you're trying to understand a question that's intentionally vague without a tool set. The other big problem is that the wrong answers are designed to sound smart. Unlike flaw questions or strengthening questions, where bad answers often contain clear logical gaps, in principal questions, the wrong answers are sneakier. They'll give you moral-sounding language, big picture ideas, and wise-sounding advice. But none of that matters. If the rule doesn't logically support the argument, it's wrong. So now you've got a test that's written in abstract terms with answers that all sound kind of valid and no clear way to tell which one is right. This is why so many students waste time here. They read the question, then they start skimming the answers, hoping one will magically feel more right than the others. But let me be blunt. There is no feel-it-out method on the LSAT. You need a process, a system, a repeatable way to break down the argument and know exactly what kind of rule is going to justify it. And that's what this video is about. Because once you understand what principal questions are really asking and how to reverse engineer the logic behind the stimulus, you'll go from second-guessing every choice to spotting the right one instantly. That's not an exaggeration. I've watched students go from missing 4 out of 5 of these to going perfect just by learning this one shift in thinking. And we're going to cover that shift step by step right now. First, let's strip away the confusing LSAT language for a second and talk about what's really happening here. When you get a principal question, the LSAT is doing something very specific. It gives you an argument that sounds fine on the surface, but is actually incomplete. Then it says, which of these rules, if assumed to be true, would make this argument valid? In other words, here's an argument with a missing piece. Can you figure out what that missing piece should be and pick it from the list? That's the entire game. Now, here's where students get tripped up. They see the word principle and assume they're being tested on ethics, values, or philosophy. But they're not. You're not being asked about what sounds good. You're not being asked what's usually true. You're being asked, if I insert this rule into the argument, does it now make logical sense? Think of it like building a table. You're given the tabletop. That's the stimulus. But one of the legs is missing. That's the assumption. And the choices are 5 different legs. Only one of them actually supports the table the way it was designed. Now let's zoom in further. There are 2 core types of principal questions. Justify the reasoning above and conforms to which principle. Both of these are asking which rule connects the dots. But here's the catch. The LSAT never gives you a perfectly complete argument in these. Instead, it gives you a piece of evidence or two, a bold conclusion that goes slightly too far, and a gap in logic that's subtle, but absolutely there. Your job is not to point out the gap. This isn't a flaw question. Your job is to fill that gap by choosing the rule that, if assumed, would make the leap from evidence to conclusion valid. Let me say that another way with a super simple formula. If evidence is true and we accept this rule, then the conclusion logically follows. That middle piece, the rule, that's the principle you're looking for. Here's where this becomes powerful. Once you internalize that structure, these questions stop being which one sounds kind of right and instead become which rule completes the logic exactly. That's why I say these questions are formulaic. Not fluffy, not philosophical, just structured logic problems that reward clarity and precision. So from here on out, we're going to treat them like what they really are. Not trick questions, not philosophy puzzles, just incomplete arguments waiting for you to drop in the missing rule. This is where the real work begins. Before you can find the missing rule, you've got to see the argument clearly. Not the way the LSAT wrote it, but the way it actually functions underneath all the fancy words. Because here's what they do. They bury a simple logical move under a pile of unnecessary detail, abstract phrasing, and polite-sounding language. Your job is to strip it down to its skeleton. Let me walk you through how to do this using examples that show you how to cut through the noise. Suppose you had an argument saying, quote, children who are regularly exposed to classical music tend to develop stronger spatial reasoning skills. Therefore, schools should include classical music in daily classroom routines. At first glance, sounds reasonable, right? But don't take it at face value. Simplify it. First, they're saying exposure to classical music leads to better spatial skills. So, schools should play classical music daily. That's it. That's the argument. Now, look at the jump. We went from a pattern, this group tends to show this trait, to a prescription, therefore, every school should act on this. What's the missing piece? It's the assumption that if something improves a mental skill, that it should be made a regular part of school activities. But we're not there yet. That's step 2. For now, just notice the jump, because the principal will have to bridge it. Here's another example. Suppose you had an argument saying, quote, several cities that installed public bike sharing programs saw a drop in traffic congestion. Therefore, our city should also launch a bike sharing program. Again, sounds solid on the surface, but don't get distracted by the good vibes around bikes in cities. Get to the logic. So the evidence would be other cities that had bikes got less traffic. Therefore, our city should do the same. So what just happened here? We made a recommendation for our city based on results in other cities. The leap, that what worked elsewhere is going to work here too. So what's the hidden assumption? That our city is similar enough to those others that the same outcome is likely. Again, that part's step 2, and we're going to get there, but right now, I want you to see the move the LSAT made. Start with something that worked in one context, then apply it to a new one without explaining why that transfer is valid. That's what the LSAT does again and again in principal questions. They give you an argument with a logical structure, but one missing piece. And if you try to tackle the choices before breaking down the argument, you're going to get stuck playing the which one sounds smartest game, and that's a trap. So here's what I tell my students. Whenever you hit a principal question, ask yourself these 2 questions. First, what's the evidence? Look for what the author observes, describes, or asserts as fact. Then ask, what's the conclusion? Find the claim that goes beyond the evidence, what the author is recommending, predicting, or assuming. Once you have these 2 pieces, you could say the argument is trying to move from evidence to conclusion. And now you're ready for step 2, where we figure out the exact rule that would make that leap valid. Once you've stripped the argument down to its core, evidence, arrow, conclusion, your next job is to build the bridge. That bridge is the missing rule. And this is where most students make a mistake. They jump into the choices too early. Don't do that. If you go to the choices without a clear idea of what you're looking for, you're going to get overwhelmed by vague language, you're going to second guess yourself, and you're going to burn 3 minutes or more deciding between 2 kind of similar answers. That's why I teach students to prephrase. What does that mean? It means you literally say the missing rule out loud in simple language before looking at the choices. Doesn't have to be elegant, doesn't have to sound like a textbook. It just has to match the logic of the argument. So let's go back to that classical music argument and talk about how to prephrase in that context. Remember there, the evidence was classical music leads to better spatial reasoning skills. So, conclusion, schools should play classical music daily. The leap is that just because something improves mental ability, It should therefore be included in school routines. So ask yourself, what would make this conclusion valid? Here's a simple version. If something improves the student's mental skills, schools should include it in the curriculum. That's your pre-phrased principle. You just created the exact kind of rule the test writer left out on purpose and what you now need to match against the choices. Now let's take the other example with that bike sharing argument. Again, it was that other cities that had bike sharing had less traffic afterwards. Therefore, our city should start bike sharing too. The leap is that we'll get the same benefit from the same action, even though it's a different city. So, what's the rule? If a policy has reduced traffic congestion in similar cities, we should expect similar results here. Simple, concrete, targeted. That's all prephrasing is. You're writing a draft version of the correct answer in your own words. And here's why prephrasing is so powerful. It forces you to engage with the logic, not just skim. It gives you a filter to evaluate the answers instead of hoping one feels close enough. And it helps you instantly eliminate tempting wrong answers that sound good but don't do the job. Now, will the correct answer always say your prephrase word for word? No, it won't, but it will match the spirit and the structure. It'll do the same logical job. So if your prephrase says, if X improves Y, we should adopt X, the right answer might say, policies that enhance important outcomes should be implemented. Same logic, slightly different words, but you'll see it because now you're hunting with a target, not wandering in the dark. Once you've got your prephrase locked in, you're ready for the final step, actually matching it to the right answer using a simple two-part test. Because now you've got a clear version of the argument. You've prephrased the missing rule. You know what kind of principle would make the logic valid. Now the final step is matching. And here's the mistake almost everyone makes. They read all 5 choices and start ranking them in their head. They'll say, this one kind of fits, but this other one sounds smarter, but that one says something about schools, so maybe. The thing is, you can't evaluate choices based on how nice they sound. That's a losing game. So I give students a 2-part test, which is a strict filter you can apply to every choice. You don't need to debate, you just test it. And if it fails either test, you eliminate it without hesitation. Now here's the 2-part match test. First we ask, does this situation match? Is the answer talking about the same kind of context, scenario, or concept as the stimulus? Then secondly, we ask, does the outcome match? If you plugged this rule into the argument, would it lead logically to the same conclusion? If both are yes, you have a contender. But if either one's a no, you eliminate it immediately. Now let's apply this to our 2 earlier examples. The first one, the classical music argument. Remember, our prephrased rule was, if something improves a student's mental skills, schools should include it. Now suppose you had an answer choice saying, quote, schools should implement programs that support cognitive development. Does this match the situation? Yes, because it's about school programs. Does it match the outcome? Yes, because it supports the action of including music for mental benefit. So therefore, you want to keep this one because it's a yes and a yes. That makes it a strong contender. Now let's look at the other example with the bike sharing argument. Remember, our prephrased rule there was, if a policy works in similar places, it's reasonable to expect it'll work here too. Now let's look at a choice that says, quote, a policy that has worked in comparable cities is likely to be effective elsewhere under similar conditions. Does it match the situation? Yes. Does it match the outcome? Also yes. Therefore, you want to keep it. This is going to be a strong contender. Now, why does this 2-part test work? Because it gives you certainty. You're no longer comparing feelings, you're checking structure. If the situation's wrong, the rule doesn't apply. If the outcome doesn't match, it doesn't justify the argument. That's it. No drama, no debate. And once you practice this on a couple dozen questions, you're going to start moving through these faster, and you'll start to see how predictable these questions really are. Now we're going to cover the advanced traps, those sneaky choices designed to trip you up even when you know the method. Let's say you've done everything right. You simplified the argument, you prephrased the missing rule, and you ran every answer through that 2-part test. But now, you're still stuck between two choices. Why? Because even when you know the structure, the LSAT bakes in traps, especially in principal questions. They're subtle, they're psychological, and if you don't know what to watch for, you're going to fall for them. So let me walk you through the 3 most common traps that trip up even advanced students, and I'll show you how to avoid each one. The first trap is the feels true principle. Because some choices sound like good advice. They seem fair, they seem reasonable and ethical. You might even find yourself thinking, yeah, that makes sense in real life. Let me give you an example. Let's say the argument said, quote, requiring employees to attend mindfulness workshops helps reduce burnout. Therefore, companies should require them. Then you might see an answer like, employers should prioritize the mental health of their workers. Sounds great, right? But the problem is, it doesn't do the job. It states a general value like mental health matters, but it doesn't connect the evidence that mindfulness helps to the conclusion that we should require it. That's the difference between a good-sounding rule and a logically necessary one. So to avoid this trap, don't ask yourself, do I agree with this? Ask, does this rule complete the argument? If it doesn't directly link the evidence to the conclusion, knock it out, no matter how much you like it. The second big trap is the scope shift. That's when the answer kind of matches the situation, but it's just a little too broad or a little too narrow. Suppose, for example, you had a stimulus saying, cities that replaced parking lots with green spaces saw an increase in local business revenue. So, cities should convert underused lots into parks. Now you see this answer. Any government policy that promotes environmental sustainability should be implemented. What's the issue? This answer is too broad. The argument's about one very specific type of policy, parks replacing parking lots, and then one very specific result, boosting local business. This principle opens the door to every sustainability policy, even those with no proven impact on business. That's a mismatch. So to avoid this trap, check the scope. Ask, is this principle really about the same type of thing the argument is about? If it casts a wider net or shifts focus to a different group, it fails the situation match in the 2-part test, so therefore you should eliminate it. Now, the third big trap is the direction reversal. This one is especially sneaky. It happens when the answer flips the direction of logic. Let's say the argument says, quote, she must value the company's mission because she keeps volunteering to stay late and work on initiatives that promote it. Then you see an answer like, anyone who values a company's mission will go above and beyond for it. Seems connected, right? But think carefully. The argument went from action to belief. The answer goes from belief to action. That is a reversal. Even though both statements deal with the same 2 ideas, valuing the mission and volunteering extra time, they don't connect it the same way, and that makes the answer wrong. So to avoid this trap, after you prephrase your rule, check the direction. Ask, does this principle move in the same direction as the argument? If your argument goes from action to belief, but the principle goes from belief to action, eliminate it. Now remember, these traps are not random. They are designed to catch students who half understand the argument but don't apply a systematic check. Once you get familiar with them, you'll start spotting them instantly and your accuracy will shoot up. And the best part is, these exact same traps appear across every principal question type. Once you've internalized how to beat them, you're not just solving one question, you're solving a whole category of LSAT logic. Now let's zoom out. So far, everything we've talked about has been tactical. How to break down the argument, how to find the missing rule, and how to match the right answer. But here's the truth most students miss. Mastering principal questions trains the exact type of thinking that top law schools care about. When you get to law school, you're not going to be reading cute 1-paragraph logic puzzles. You're going to read 30-page cases filled with weird fact patterns, inconsistent testimony, and judges who contradict themselves mid-sentence. And your job, in every class, in every exam, in every real-life case, is going to be this. Take a messy situation, extract the relevant facts, and apply a general rule. That's it. Every law school exam is just a longer version of a principal question. Here's what happened, here's the statute or precedent, apply the rule, and argue your way to a conclusion. If you can't do that, it doesn't matter how good your writing is or how hard you study. You're going to get buried. So when you learn to nail principal questions on the LSAT, you're doing more than just earning points. You're building the exact mental habits you'll use in 1L and beyond. Here's what that looks like in practice. You stop taking arguments at face value, and you start asking, what assumption is doing the heavy lifting here? You're going to get comfortable abstracting, moving from this person drank tea to here's a rule about behavior and outcomes. You'll learn to separate what feels true from what follows logically. That's legal thinking. And that's why students who master this question type often say, once I figured this out, everything else on the LSAT got easier. It's a forcing function. It trains you to think slowly, clearly, and structurally, even when the wording is vague or the answers are tempting. So don't treat principal questions just like another LSAT hurdle. Treat them like a gym for your brain. The more reps you do, the sharper you get, and the more confident you'll be, not just on test day, but on day one of law school. So again, here's the process. Step 1, break the argument down. Ignore the fancy words. Boil it down to evidence, therefore conclusion. And spot the leap, the assumption the author is making but not saying. Then step 2, prephrase the rule. Ask, what rule would justify this conclusion based on the evidence? Say it out loud in plain English. Doesn't have to sound smart, just needs to do the job. Then step 3, run the 2-part test. Ask, does the situation match? Does this rule even apply to the argument's topic? And does the outcome match? Does this rule actually support the same conclusion? If either fails, eliminate it. Run this process every single time. Not sometimes, not when you feel stuck, every time. Because when it becomes automatic, principal questions stop being abstract logic puzzles and they become checklists. And when something becomes a checklist, you stop feeling anxious, you stop second-guessing yourself, and you stop wasting time. You just move. Fast, accurate, repeatable. That's how top scorers do it.